Okay.
And as kind of I walk through those and talk to students about it, I've been really interested in kind of transferring that to look at our work in student affairs.
And you're
one of these
stuck in
days I'll
too.
actually do that study.
Oh my goodness.
I'll
Get
help you.
somebody to
That's
pay
good.
for a sabbatical.
I know I applied for spring 2017 to do so. We'll see how it
Just don't
goes.
smack the computer.
Don't bump into it. Don't.
Hi, internet.
Don't breathe on
We're
it.
live now.
Don't. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
I gotta go sit over there.
You're fine.
Is this picking her up?
Yes.
Okay.
Not you. Janice, I'm Tim. I don't know.
I'm Janice Johnson.
Nice to meet you. We've met virtually.
Yes, that's very nice.
Sounds like every time I show up, you have a different committee.
There you are.
How does this go? I'm ready whenever you are.
Okay.
I'll just hold this up for a second. And then there's the
All right. Hi. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Liz's Defense. This is a pretty straightforward process. How this works is we'll have Liz introduce her committee, and you find folks around the room. We will turn the floor over to her for about 30 minutes to present her research. Then at that point, we will open the floor for questions. Following that, we will step out of the room to deliberate and return with our verdict at the end of that. I never should like that word. So at the end of it, again, we come back and congratulate Liz and let you all have her back. So at this point, I will turn the floor over to Liz.
Thank you. Well, I want to start by introducing my committee, who you just saw is Dr. Cardinal. He is a professor in this program and the chair of my committee, and he has had the joy of reading every draft of what became my dissertation probably 7 or 8 times. So thank you for that. We also have Dr. Janice Jones, who was our professor for leadership professor for research every single year in this program. Depending on the day, sometimes you're the chair of the department.
I am right now.
She's
Yes.
the chair today. Today she's the chair. Dr. Jonas does not like to get rid of that title. So she has gratefully joined my committee as of late because another committee member had to take another step. But Janice also got to read early versions of this in research class. And my guest committee member is Dr. Timothy Gordon, who is the Dean of Students at UW-Milwaukee, and interested in research about technology and student affairs, and very excited to have him on my committee as well. So, my work, the long dissertation title is An Examination of the Relationship Between Communication Methods Used in Out-of-Class Student-Faculty Interactions and the Content and Frequency of Those Interactions. The blog post title was How Students Communicate with Faculty. So we could use that if we would like going forward. I was very interested in this because when I started this program 5 years and 3 months ago, I was working in university housing at UW-Milwaukee in a role within student affairs where we talked a lot about student engagement. Student engagement being the amount of time and energy students put into the college experience. And we knew that that was very important. However, all of the research about student engagement was done in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, and this was now 2010, and I was communicating with students and RAs using Facebook and Twitter, and institutions were just starting to get into social media. So I really wanted to see what does that mean for theory about student engagement. So I was looking at what all the research said, and it basically said that students who interact with faculty, particularly about specific topics, and those 7 topics in this study I have little icons for. I use one of my former student employees. Are academic and course selection, faculty research, campus activities, ideas about readings or class, grades and assignments, and career preparation. So students who interact with faculty specifically about these 7 topics have higher levels of student engagement and are more successful at college. They have higher GPAs, they persist longer, and ultimately they are more likely to graduate. I was really interested in this students who interact with faculty part because all of the research talks about going to office hours. And that's just not how a lot of students are communicating with faculty anymore. So I wanted to dig a little bit into that and see what I could learn. So I came up with 2 specific research questions after struggling with this for about 1.5 years. Research question number 1. was, is there a relationship between the method of communication used, specifically in out-of-class interactions, and the content of those interactions? So are students who are meeting with faculty face-to-face more likely to talk about grades, or is that something they talk about via email or maybe on a Facebook page? The second research question was, is there a relationship between the methods students use to communicate with faculty outside of class and the frequency of those interactions? So are students who use certain types of communication likely to communicate more often overall with faculty? Because the research says more communication equals higher student engagement equals better college outcomes. So I went to the literature and I found a set of theorists to inform my work and some outcomes that were coming out of recent literature about how students communicated. So theoretically, I came at this from an integrationist perspective of higher education, meaning I believe, as do many theorists, that what happens to students in college, the experiences they have, what they do while they are on campus within their 4, 5, 6, 7 years, affects their outcomes. So because of that, for this study, I didn't include any pre-existing outcomes, such as college preparation, demographics, SAT scores, things like that. Those were not considered in this study. We're looking at what happens at college. And specifically, I was looking at student involvement and engagement. Alexander Aston started studying student involvement in the 1970s, and he later coined the term student engagement, which was then furthered on by George Koo. And again, this is the amount of time and energy students put into the college experience. Research has shown a lot of things that matter, and I've summarized that in this table that is completely unable to be read on the live stream and probably not in the back of this room. But Alexander Aston, in 1993, in his revised book, gave all these variables of things that students do. Hours spent studying, having an internship in college, doing independent research, and the things that it affects related to academic outcomes, retention and degree completion, college GPA, graduating with honors, and ultimately enrolling in graduate school. And many of these have a positive relationship with these academic outcomes. Student-faculty interaction has a positive relationship with every single one of them. So I chose to focus specifically on that aspect of student engagement. I also saw a few themes in the literature as I was reviewing it. I was specifically looking at, what's been done since the mid-90s forward relating to how students are communicating. So we have seen that online communication may impact college outcomes differently. There's very little bit of research about this, but Laird and Koo in 2008 did a review of some experimental questions on the National Study of Student Engagement, specifically looking at wired campuses and students that communicated with faculty in an online environment. And they had a hypothesis that that might even be a different type of engagement, but it doesn't look like they explored that further. And then there was a 2010 dissertation that really looked at, is online communication a completely different type of communication that we have to look at? We do know, I don't think this is a shock to anybody in the room, that students use social networking sites and online communication increasingly. This is almost ubiquitous among students at this point, but the literature has been proving that out as early as 2008, where Esther Hargitay was doing research on large public campuses and finding that the majority of students were using, at the time, Facebook, MySpace, and online forums. But we also know that faculty adoption of social networking sites is increasing, so there could be an opportunity here to increase student-faculty interaction online. So there were some studies in 2011 and in 2014. The faculty-focused study in 2011 was specifically looking at what faculty members use social media personally and for academic reasons, usually for research and communicating with colleagues. There was very little about faculty using it to communicate with students, although some newer research has done that. And then in his 2014 book, Ray Junko talked about how this can really be an opportunity for us to increase student interaction if we use social media in the right ways. And then finally, there's an interesting line in the research that we really don't know if online and offline interaction are related. I didn't touch on this a lot in my study. It's an idea for future research. But some of these studies looked at online social networks and offline social networks, and if there was a relationship between the size of someone's online network and their offline network. And each of these came to differing conclusions on that. So that's kind of up for debate still. So how did I go about my study? I had an explanatory correlational design. I was trying to study something that's already happening. I didn't want to get involved in it. I couldn't set up an experiment, so I did a point-in-time study with college students asking how they communicate with faculty. So I'm looking at relationships. I can't determine any type of cause and effect with a correlational design. I did do an online survey. So one limitation here is I'm asking a lot about online communication in an online forum. So it's quite likely that I have a little bit of a bias in my results towards online communication. However, I do not have the time or resources to go and interview this sample in person, nor do I think they'd want to talk to me. So this was the most reasonable method for this study. It is a quantitative study, so all the analysis was done in SPSS using a combination of chi-square analysis and point-by serial correlations, and I finally figured out stats. Tony would be so proud. And these were my variables. So I looked at communication method. I studied 11 methods of communication. I asked students if they had interacted with faculty face-to-face, via email, instant message, on the phone with their voice, on the phone with a text message, Facebook private, Facebook public, Twitter private, Twitter public, the course management system, and video chat. So I wanted to see if any of these were being used with faculty and how that might affect these other variables. So I asked them also how often they interact with faculty using all of these methods in totality, and I asked them for a monthly number, how often they did that. And then I asked if they engaged, yes or no, in any topic of communication. So I had 2 categorical variables here and then 1 continuous variable. So then it was time to develop the survey instrument. This took a long time until I really decided what I was trying to study, but then it kind of all fell into place. I started online by querying my friends and college students who I had worked with throughout the years and their friends to find out what methods of communication they were using to interact with faculty. So this was in the summer of 2014 that I was finalizing these variables. I asked, I got a lot of responses, and that's how I ultimately came to the 11 communication methods that I studied. I then took that and I ran it by an expert in the field who is one of the folks on my citation list that has been doing studies like this using similar instruments, and asked him for his opinion on the survey instrument, and he gave me some great feedback that I used to modify it. I then went back to the internet in January of this year when I had the survey what I thought was finished, and I asked for college students that were outside of the sample area to go take the survey, not so I could gather their data, but that they could tell me about the survey experience. Did they find it easy to follow? Was there anything that was confusing? And I had over 20 people take the survey at this point. They provided some great feedback, and ultimately I just had to change some formatting and emphasis on what made some of the questions different from each other. And then I was ready to field the survey. So that was my validity in that space. So now it's time to figure out if this is a reliable survey. So I did a pilot study at the same place where I ultimately collected my final data. I had a sample of 2,000 students, and this was a stratified sample, so I had 500 each from freshmen through seniors. And I did this online with SurveyMonkey and had a 14.75% response rate, ultimately had 281 responses I could use. So first of all, what I saw here is I was getting about the same response rate that some of the researchers using online surveys with college students have been getting, but this was not a statistically significant population. I needed about 326 responses for this to be statistically significant, so this was a concern for me right away, and I addressed that in IRB. I'll talk about that in a second. I then ran some reliability statistics on parts of the survey. So Combox Alpha for the 7-item content measure. Again, this was yes or no. Did you do these 7 types, or have these 7 types of communications with faculty? That came in at 0.773, so over 0.7, showing an acceptable level of reliability for that scale. There was an 11-item scale about these communication methods. That was only 0.581. However, if you dig into the data, there were so few students using some of those video chat, Twitter, that we really didn't think this one was going to have a regular distribution, and I was okay with that moving forward. So knowing what my response rate was, knowing what my reliability was, I took this to IRB, and I dug into the literature, and I found additional studies that had taken pilot studies and combined them with a sample from a final survey collection and used that for their analysis. I asked for and ultimately received permission to do that with this because the pilot and the final administration were at the same institution within the same semester, very similar population. So I determined my reliability before bringing this to IRB, and then I turned around and I did it all again. Another 2,000 sample, stratified. My response rate was even lower this time, so I'm glad I planned on filling this. I also had incentives, so students could get a $50 Amazon card for doing this, and I'm going to say some of them never even claimed it. So if you're out there, students, some of you still have $50 on Amazon that I sent you. 11.3% response rate, so the N on this one was 220. Combine that with the pilot sample to get an N of 507, which was statistically significant. Almost the exact same Cronbach's alpha on this one, 0.773, so I'm feeling good about the reliability. Got a little bit better on that 11-item measure, but again, didn't think we were going to have as high of a reliability on that section. So that is the survey instrument and data collection. And then I found some stuff out, so I'm really excited to share that with you. So our first research question was, is there a relationship between the method that college students are using to communicate with faculty outside of class and the content of those interactions in the 7 areas that we know are related to student engagement? And the answer is yes. Hooray! It's a lot more complicated than that, though. So for this section of analysis, 11 methods, 7 topics, 77 chi-squares. So I had to determine if there was a relationship between each of those, and then the strength of that relationship. So I did an odds ratio, which I've rounded in this presentation for ease on your eyes and understanding. Basically, I will look at each method of communication and each topic and be able to tell you if a student uses this method, they're 2, 3, 4 more times likely to talk about this topic than students who don't use that method of communication and interact with faculty. So here's what we have there. Face-to-face, related to all 7 communication methods. So this is still great. Faculty should still have office hours. Students who communicate with faculty face-to-face are 3 times more likely to have conversations about campus activities, faculty research, career exploration, and ideas about class, and 4 times more likely than their peers who are not communicating face-to-face with faculty to talk about grades or assignments, academic program and course selection, and other social topics. So we move on to the LMS, the learning management system that students are using on campus. Again, related to all 7 topics of communication. A little bit less so than face-to-face, but 2 times as likely for campus activities, social interaction, ideas, and faculty research, and 3 times as likely to talk about academic course selection, career development, and grades. So now we're getting into the ones that are a little less related to all items, but still interesting findings here. Students are still talking to faculty on the phone. They're 2 times more likely to talk about general social interactions or ideas from class. 3 times more likely to talk about faculty research, academic program and course selection, and campus activities, and 4 times more likely to talk about their career readiness and preparedness. Moving on to text message, we're still seeing some interesting relationships here. 2 times as likely to talk about academic program or course selection, career, faculty research or ideas, and 3 times as likely to talk about social topics and campus activities via text. Students who use Facebook public messages, I separated public and private because I thought there might be a difference there, and that really did play out. So I explained to students that a public message was anything they thought other people could see. A private message was sent via the private chat feature on Facebook. So students who communicate with faculty publicly on Facebook are 2 times more likely to talk about their career or faculty research, and 3 times more likely to talk about campus activities, ideas related to class, and general social topics. When they get to private message, there were some really interesting findings here. So similarly to some other things, 3 times more likely to talk about research and ideas, 4 times more likely to talk about career, 6 times more likely to talk about general social topics, and 9 times more likely to talk about campus activities if they've reported that they've communicated with faculty using a private Facebook message. Instant message, which I refer to in the survey as GChat, AOL Instant Messenger if you're still using that, usually GChat these days. A few relationships here, 3 times more likely to talk about campus activities, 4 times more likely to talk about faculty research, and 5 times more likely to just have general social conversation with faculty. Twitter public message was only related to 1 of these topics. Students who report tweeting publicly with faculty members are 4 times more likely to report also talking about campus activities. So there are 9 communication methods here. Actually, there's 1 more I'm going to forget. Video chat, 3 times more likely to talk about faculty research. 9 communication methods, had significant relationships. There were 2 that didn't: Twitter private message and email. And so the thing about email, I really wanted to report about email in this study, but to do a chi-square analysis to determine if there's a significant relationship there, you have to have enough people that say they didn't communicate with faculty using email. You have to have an expected value of 5 in each of the 4 quadrants. And there were 99-point-something% of students said they communicated with faculty doing email, so I could not conduct a chi-square analysis and find any type of relationship. It was the same thing with private Twitter messages, but opposite. Not enough students actually reported doing that. So those were the results for research question 1. There's a really great infographic that combines all of those that I'll be putting on my blog at some point. So thanks to Michaela for designing that for me. Second research question: is there a relationship between these methods of communication and the frequency of interactions? So how often they communicate with faculty every month. Is that related to how they communicate with them? Yes, sort of. It's a weak correlation. So first I ran these statistics using each type of communication method, and these were the ones that came up as having some sort of relationship. They all had a correlation between 0.1 and 0.3, so in the social sciences, this is a weak correlation. It works for research, but it's probably nothing I'm going to go hang my hat on out there and say that there's a really strong relationship there. So at boot camp this summer, I met with our statistics professor and asked him, what would you do with this? How help me? And he gave me the idea to come up with another variable, which was the number of methods students reported using to communicate with faculty. So I constructed my own variable there. So the value for that variable was either 0 or up to 11, depending on how many methods they reported. And that had a stronger correlation than any individual method. So what we're seeing here is that there is a moderate correlation, 0.366, between how many methods a student uses to communicate with faculty and how often they report communicating with them. So the more methods they use, the more likely they are to report higher frequency of interaction. If we want to look specifically at what they reported for frequencies, they reported 20.8 interactions per month on average. Some were much, much higher than this. The literature right now says 4 to 6 interactions with a faculty member per year. So again, this literature is old. It's talking about office hours. It's not considering email as a contact. It's not considering a quick G-chat as a contact. When you consider those things, students in this study are saying almost 21 times a month they're interacting with faculty, almost every single day. Another interesting thing here is that students who reported using either of the Facebook or Twitter methods to communicate with faculty reported twice the average number of monthly interactions. So they're getting 40 to 50 interactions a month if they're also saying that they use social media. So really interesting findings there. So what exactly does that mean? I've got implications for a whole lot of things since this program requires us to do that. But first, implications for practice. What I think this means for faculty on campus. Before I jump into this, I want to say I am not a campus faculty member. I don't walk in their shoes, and this is one study at one population, so look forward to exploring these implications further. But based on the data in this study, I think faculty should offer multiple methods of communication with students. Specifically, I think they should have at least 3 to 5 options available listed in their syllabus to contact them. You could get through that pretty quickly with standard communication methods if you use the 2 that have the highest relationship, so face-to-face and course management system. Let them know you're going to be jumping into those discussions. Maybe give a cell number for text messages or figure out some technology so you don't have to give out your personal cell number to do that. And then maybe do an instant message. There you've got 4, and you've got ways that students can communicate. I also want to make sure that faculty don't discount the traditional communication methods, meaning face-to-face interaction and using the institutionalized learning management system. These were the most likely to be reported by students as being used, and they were the most likely to, or they had the highest relationships with all 7 content types that mattered. So I am not saying abandon office hours. I am not saying abandon the campus course management system, but expand some communication around that. I also want to mention that faculty should not shy away from communicating about non-academic topics. So the literature says that all 7 of these topics are important. 2 of them, campus activities and general social ideas, probably aren't what faculty are thinking about talking to students about all the time, but over half of the students in this sample reported using those methods of communication, or you talking about those things. And research says they still matter. So encouraging communication about what's going on campus or just general social stuff you have in common could be useful. So some implications for leadership, because this is a PhD in leadership for the advancement of learning and service. It took me 3 years to learn that full name correctly. Implications for leadership. I think leaders should strive to be multimodal communicators. We need to be great in person. We need to be great on a stage. We need to be great via email. We need to know how to tweet. We need to understand how to have a public social media presence. And we have to figure out how video works. Hi, Internet. So good leaders should know how to communicate in all of these methods and probably more that I haven't included here. We also need to be willing to provide or seek training on innovative communication methods. So a multimodal leader that is doing these things really great needs to be able to help other folks seeking that training to do that well and help people understand who maybe didn't grow up in such a fragmented communication landscape, how they can work that into their day-to-day in a way that works for them. Implications for learning. I'm trying to get done with this in my 30-minute time allotment. So in addition to face-to-face and LMS, I think we need to consider using text messages and Facebook private messages for learning activities. This specifically is because text messages and Facebook private messages were highly related to conversations about ideas from reading or from class. So students that aren't really getting into the discussion right there in class, they might get into that via a text message conversation, maybe a group conversation, or a Facebook private group for the class. They might explore more of that there with their peers and with faculty. Interestingly, I also ask students, how often do you do these things? Do you have the opportunity to use these communication methods? And how much would you like to use these communication methods? It was outside the scope of my research questions, but I wanted to know it anyway. Text messaging and Facebook, both public and private, had a pretty decent gap between opportunity to use and desire to use. So there is room for students to do that. They're saying they want to do it and they haven't had the opportunity to communicate with faculty in that way. Also, another implication for learning, I believe we need to support faculty learning regarding new communication methods, especially for out-of-class interactions. Again, similar to the implications for leadership, if we are seeing that 3, 4, 5, 6 different types of communication is what we expect a faculty member to use, you can't just tell them that, expect them to throw on their syllabus into it. Every new communication tool is almost like a new environment and a new language, and we need to help people understand that through learning and development. And then implications for service. So I do think that it's very important to consider differences before making assumptions about an entire group. So that entire group here being college students. I just told you that college students who report using social networking with faculty have twice the average number of monthly interactions. I just told you that some of these online communication methods are really great and related to very important topics. However, research has told us that there are racial differences of social networking site users. The 2008 research from Esther Hargitay pointed that out. Specifically, African Americans and Hispanics have different behaviors that they report related to what networks they use and how they use them. In my data, African American students, which were a small amount of my sample, about 4.1% N of 21, not a single one of them reported using social networking sites to communicate with faculty. So I cannot generalize this to the African American student population on campus and say that would be great, because they are not telling me they're doing it. They are also less likely to use text messaging or interact face-to-face than the other students in the sample. So there's already an in-group difference here that is important to understand. So is this because of access? Is this because of communication preferences? Is this because of other things going on campus? I don't know. I haven't dug into that. But it's definitely, if you're service-minded and looking to be inclusive, it's a relationship, or it's a bit of the data to be very, very aware of. And then implications for research. All the other stuff we could figure out if we wanted to keep doing this. I think it's important to explore the alignment between student and faculty communication preferences. I didn't ask faculty how they wanted to communicate. I didn't talk to a single faculty member in this study or ask them to fill out my survey. I just talked about students. So the faculty side of it, as far as my dissertation is concerned, is still silent. I think it's important to try and examine the direct relationship between communication methods and the content of that interaction. These are just correlations. Did you use Facebook and did you talk about these things? I did not know if they used Facebook to talk about a specific topic. So looking at exactly how students are communicating about each exact topic would be interesting. I'd also like to gather more data about college student communication with other people groups. So when I started this study, when I started the dissertation process, I was going to ask students about their communication with faculty, I was going to ask them about their communication with student affairs professionals and their peers, and I was going to figure it all out, and it was going to be great, and then I realized I wanted to get out of here in less than a decade, so we focused on what the research said was most important. I still think those would be interesting, because students are very high-frequency users, according to other data sources, of a lot of social networks and online communication that they're not using a lot to communicate with faculty. I'd like to know if that differs among these different groups on campus. And then I also think it's important to revisit the impact of Twitter on student-faculty interactions. A lot of the early published research that was coming out in 2011, 2012 was focusing on Twitter as an intervention with students and increasing student engagement, retention, and GPA. I found very low utilization of Twitter in this study, where data was collected in 2015 on a campus that I personally believe embraces social media. So I would have expected to see a little bit more of that, and I think that needs to be further studied. And then finally, I think it'd be great to determine if an optimal frequency for student-faculty communications exists. So the literature is saying 4 to 6 times per year is what's happening, but more is better. My data is showing 21 times a month. So is that good? Should it be 100 a month? Should it be 10 a month? We don't know. All we know is that there's a positive relationship at this point, and we don't know if there's a ceiling and a point of diminishing returns. And I know faculty want to sleep, so they would probably like to know where that is. So that is the data I collected. I want to check my time, so I'm curious. 30 minutes and 12 seconds.
Awesome.
So open it up for questions.
Well, good job. Tim or Janice, would you like to jump in?
So, Liz, you alluded to in kind of future research, looking at some of the impacts on faculty. If if a chief academic officer approached you and said, this data is really interesting, how should I really be equipping my faculty? What might your recommendation or response be?
I would want to look at some of the things that students are already with faculty about and make sure we have 3 to 5 communication methods covered that my research and hopefully future research will say matters, but that faculty are comfortable using and students are saying they want to do it. And then find, don't say you have to do 11 things. Focus on 3 to 5 and find the ones that already seem to have a little bit of momentum, and then provide some solid training about how to use that in a learning environment. And then give me a grant to keep doing research.
Thanks.
How do you think this would work being a graduate student? How do you think this study would look with graduate students?
How do I think the study would be graduate students? So one thing I didn't do in this study that I'd be interested in doing is talking about what the majority of their class experience was like. Was it in person? Was it online? This particular institution, about a quarter of students are taking at least one class online. So when I think about graduate study, I think about a lot of my folks that are in distant programs. And they're using these methods a lot more because they're not in a classroom. If I had to make a wild hypothesis, I would presume that graduate students are communicating with faculty more. They're probably just communicating with fewer faculty in total. So we G-chat. We Facebook. And I think it also, you would likely have different results in each graduate program you go to based on the faculty that are here. I know there's faculty here that I would not be Facebooking with. But my committee Facebooked from the table, so. I would expect to see more communication with faculty with graduate students, but I don't have a lot of experience at the very traditional graduate programs where people aren't working and they're not.
How do you account for changing technology? At the beginning you mentioned some things, everybody laughed because like MySpace is out.
Yeah, but Justin Timberlake owns it now, right? So the question was, how do I account for changing technology?
And I think it goes back to what you were talking about, keeping people trained and up to date. We switched the learning management program here over summer, and it's caused me a great deal of distress.
Yes. So there's the institutional change in communication, and then there's the social change in communication, looking at social media, online communication. I do not think faculty and students, as far as their communication with each other, need to be on the bleeding edge of communication. I think there are select faculty that will want to be, but I'm looking at Facebook and Twitter. Facebook is 11 years old at this point. Twitter is 6 or 7. Maybe 8. So these are actually pretty entrenched methods of communication at this point. I think that it would be a little bit of a waste of time for practitioners to jump on the brand new method and try to integrate it into their class unless that is something they love and absolutely fits with the class matter. I think that an astute campus administration faculty can monitor trends, and if something sticks around for 3 years, start looking at it. But you don't need to be worrying about how to put Periscope in your classroom right now, because Periscope is live streaming stuff.
You could tell by my face.
Yes. I'm also not Snapchatting my defense. I don't
Good.
use Snapchat. I might in 3 years if it's still around. So, the big talk right now in student affairs is, how are we using Snapchat? How are we using Yik Yak? What are you going to do with Periscope on campus? There will be the bleeding edge technologists that are important, but when I'm looking at technology for learning, I don't think you have to worry about it until it's something that, if I'm looking at the Pew Internet Survey, if it's not a 30% penetration in the demographic you're interested in, don't worry about it. For classroom communication, I don't see Instagram being a thing, but for out-of-class communication, Instagram is now entrenched. It's something like 60% of college students are using it, but it came out how many years ago? So it's new to folks that haven't been using it. I think you can watch the trends and should always have a heads up that it's coming. Unless your campus changes your course management system and may not provide training there. That's a different beast, I think. But for popular communication, don't jump on the bandwagon. Wait for a critical mass.
So, and then what about boundaries? Are you recommending faculty have 2 Facebook accounts?
What about boundaries? That's a great question. I think that's so I would not recommend that faculty have 2 Facebook accounts because that would violate Facebook's terms of service. However,
So
and
here's
then
the
they come
deal.
get you.
I'm on vacation and the student calls me on the phone and says, I see on Facebook that you're up in Door County. I'm like, oh my God.
So I think,
I didn't like that.
yeah, I think so. I think with proper training, we can equip faculty to communicate in a way that they are comfortable with and maintain those boundaries. So I would never, ever mandate that faculty have public, personal Facebook profiles that they friend their students on. If they want to, that is fine. However, I would strongly recommend they have a public page, which is a different way of communicating on Facebook, for their faculty presence as a public figure, where they can still communicate publicly with the world, but not post their vacation photos there. Because that is their professional life. That's where they talk about coursework and research. Twitter, you can have multiple accounts. That's not a problem. I think training is a huge issue because it's a whole new communication landscape and environment and language, and there's a way to do it well. But if you just tell people, go use Facebook, go use Twitter, the likelihood of them doing it right the first time without any guidance probably is not very high. So, communication, we've always taught public speaking. Why wouldn't we teach public online presence? I think it makes sense.
I'd like to ask some predictive questions. You mentioned at the end there, it took the question right off the page, about the point of diminishing returns. And where do you think that point is? And that's just, I don't know, using me for an example. I use the GChat, I use Facebook, not so much on Twitter, text, phone, Canvas, our LMS system here. So was that 5?
I wasn't counting.
Well,
But you're
it's
good.
yeah,
You're in the
somewhere
recommendations.
thereabouts. At what point do I lose the connection and the student feels like I don't know where to reach, or I feel like I don't want to? Is there a singular way that I could just have everybody contact me at once? Where's the point where in your opinion, where the student feels like, all right, this is too much, or the faculty member feels like this is too much?
Our dissertation manual says if you do not know the answer to a question, you should say, I do not know. I have no idea. I can tell you that I feel tired in all the ways I communicate with people. That's why I'm not on Snapchat, and that's why I haven't downloaded Yik Yak. And I think there's probably a different threshold for everybody. What I'm most interested in finding out is the point of diminishing returns for the number of interactions a student should have with a faculty member. I think the number of communication methods an individual or faculty member would use is so personal. I don't know if you could make a generalization about that.
It'd also be interesting to think about that from a discipline perspective. If there are different disciplines that might support more or less methods to that.
If you're a
based
PR professor, I would hope you're on the high end.
Right.
If you're a physicist, probably on the lower end. I don't know, there are some really cool physicists on the internet. So.
But thinking about your idea of training faculty and training people in general about communication methods, how to become efficient with it, I think would be a central piece of that. So it doesn't feel like, I'm tired of having 8 different modes to communicate, but to use 5 efficiently where it doesn't become a burden.
I would agree with that.
You touched a little bit on researcher bias, and from having me in class, I always talk to people about researcher bias, but expand on that a little more. How do you think your bias might have influenced your study? Or maybe your passion for this line?
So, the question was, how do I think my bias has influenced the study? So I try very much not to let my bias influence the study because I recognize my bias up front. So the one thing I did say, I was looking at a lot of online communication methods, and I did this online. So that is one thing. I also researched in an area that I'm very familiar with, and a culture that I'm familiar with people that I'm familiar with. So I wasn't expecting massive surprises. I think it would be interesting if I redid this study in an area of the country where I have absolutely no experience, or on a very different type of campus, say a community college or a historically black college. I think it would be very interesting to duplicate this research there. I felt like I was able to remove my bias because I was not present at the research site at any point. I had multiple people read the instrument that aren't all up on these types of communication methods to make sure it made sense to them. And I did ask about 11 methods of communication, but that was a limited list. I could have asked for a lot more. So I tried not to create a survey instrument that was leading to give people to tell me all the new online social networks they were using to communicate with faculty. But by some definite bias in that I use a lot of these things to communicate professionally, personally, and academically. And I was actually, when I started looking at my pilot data, because I got to analyze this twice thanks to having a class at just the right time, I did not actually expect the results that I got with social networks. What I saw come up first was face-to-face and learning management systems being so highly related to everything that mattered. I actually thought I was going to be presenting research that said social media doesn't matter as a faculty member, so forget about it. So I really tried to make sure that if it was coming through in the numbers, it really was. It wasn't me wanting it.
I think your results based on racial differences are really, really interesting. And I think under your implications for future research, you should think about a qualitative study where you
I was going to say I'd have to interview some people.
You're going to have to talk to some people and find out what's up with that, and to really understand, I think, versus some sort of check the box kind of response.
My hypothesis would be those students who told me they didn't use social media to communicate with faculty use social media. I assume they use it. They just don't with faculty, and I would be very interested in finding out why.
I wrote questions down, but you've covered everything.
That's a lot. She had a full paper.
Another speculative question. How long before faculty don't have a choice? And that's just thinking about some faculty members here not in our department, just in Stritch in general. No,
You got one back.
I'm not naming any names, but there are some people who just prefer not to do any of this. And again, my speculative question is, how long before they don't have a choice?
So they're required to have office hours, I would assume, because the research has established for decades that matters. I would think if I and other researchers can continue to replicate this study and get higher generalizability, understand a lot more of the ifs and what's behind it, if we're 10 to 15 years from now and we know in published research, because that's how long it takes to publish a paper, right? 10 to 15.
Yeah, after they review it and send it back.
If we have leading researchers in the field putting this out there, and that information is getting to provosts and to presidents, I think you could see a time, I don't think it would be until 2025 or 2030, where you have new requirements for communication. And based on what's coming out of this, I don't think requirements of office hours would go away. But I think you might have requirements of multiple contact methods on a syllabus. If the research shows they are related to things that result in positive college outcomes, and it's been published like that for a decade, that's when we'll get there, I think. So most faculty that may be resistant right now will probably retire by then. But, apparently you have some in mind. I would say minimum 10 to 15 years.
Well, I think the consumer is going to drive some of that as well.
The marketing offices and the student affairs offices, they'll be on that train if they're not already very soon.
Right. And I think that the students, even in recruiting, my son was horrified when he got this lovely handwritten note. Thank you for visiting our college. I thought it was lovely. He said, I would never go there. They're like dinosaurs. He wanted some sort of thing to pop up.
He wanted a tweet that said, "It's awesome to see you on our campus."
Send us your selfie.
Right, something like that. And that was in 2008. So I'm guessing that the consumer will help drive that shift for faculty as well.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting. We are seeing a lot of multimodal communication in recruitment, in admissions, in student affairs. So the pre-college experience right now is multimodal. If you jump into the classroom and you're immediately not, that's a disconnect.
Right.
So it's another interesting thing to look at.
I like that. I think this discussion, this study has the potential to redefine what high touch means in terms of how we interact and how students feel connected and how they feel integrated into the academic community.
I think one of the trends that I'm watching now is that as certain areas become multimodal, part of what's catching up or having to, so if a student discloses, posts something on a Facebook page and there's nobody there to respond to it or kind of pick up, back to your point, I'm going to leave the campus or I'm struggling in this class or whatever the case may be, there's also still this mismatch I see between kind of how it's being managed and really what the consumer expects.
Questions from the audience?
I can ask her in private.
Mark Gesner has a question.
I just thought the question or the point made about the disciplines was really interesting, and clearly didn't mention LinkedIn, which is, I guess, not the same kind of instrument, but I know in the business discipline, everyone who has our internship class is required to at least establish one and try it. I pull up Liz's as an example often for those students.
That's why you're looking at my profile.
It really is the main reason. I'm sorry.
I get a notification. Mark Gesner has
Once every few months. Yeah, so, anyway.
That's doing wonders for your stats.
So, where's LinkedIn?
So I did not use LinkedIn as a method here because it didn't come up at all when I was looking for suggestions from other folks. And the research I've seen from the Pew Internet and American Life Project, which is my go-to of penetration among the greater American community of social media, is showing that folks aren't using LinkedIn until they're out of school. So business might be different. That'd be very interesting. Again, maybe a little bit of my bias too. I don't do a lot of communicating on LinkedIn, and very few people communicate with me on LinkedIn. It's more of a, hey, come look at me type of thing, not a, hey, let's interact. It would be very interesting to look at, but some of the third-party research I was looking at was showing that it's not something students are thinking about while they're in college, and that when I was on campuses, that seemed true to me as well. They should be, though, so thank you for teaching your students to use it.
You're my mentor.
Aaron, you have a question?
Yes. Do interface changes on these social media networks cause fluidity between the audience? So, like, if Facebook changes their feed and all that kind of stuff, and it's unpopular for a while, do you see a massive decrease or increase of traffic?
I have no data related to that question. Anecdotally, people get used to it real quick.
We complain about it for a while.
Yes. Remember when Newsfeed came?
Yes.
I quit Facebook. No one quit Facebook.
Other questions? Well, thank you. All right, and we'll just go next door. Okay.
Bye, Internet. See you later. There were 15 people watching.
Yeah, that's nice.